Hello, everyone. Welcome to our channel, Leadership Ledger. I'm thrilled and excited to introduce our guest today, the Chief Information Security Officer at Allianz Direct. With a wealth of experience in cybersecurity, he leads a dedicated team of governance, risk and compliance, and security engineering. In his current role, he has been instrumental in building a robust DevSecOps culture and spearheading significant compliance initiatives with a recent focus on DORA, Digital Operational Resilience Act. Before stepping into the CISO role, he honed his expertise in security consulting, covering corporate security, enterprise resilience, and later security strategy at one of the Big Four advisory firms. Beyond his day-to-day work on DevSecOps, identity access management, and compliance, he stays deeply engaged with GRC engineering, cybersecurity economics, and the evolving landscape of AI governance. When not navigating the complexity of cybersecurity, he enjoys spending quality time with his wife and 2-year-old son. Please join me in welcoming our guest. Hi, Anton. How are you today?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me.
Could you take us through your journey, starting with the initial spark that drew you into cybersecurity and leading up to that pivotal moment when you realized you were ready to step into the CISO role?
For sure. I mean, I think like many people, I didn't have a straightforward path into becoming a CISO. I think even on my CV, it kind of looks like it, but for me, it felt more all over the place. I was studying engineering management, which is kind of half business administration, half mechanical engineering. And typically, I think people either go into like project management in automotive parts companies or become auditors. And I didn't really find either of those things super interesting. And what I wanted to do then, which I think was a bit out there, was I wanted to become a spy or work in national security kind of intelligence stuff, right? Which, while I noticed that I found that interesting, was something that I wasn't really ready for, because I didn't do any military service, I didn't study political science, or didn't study any language sciences or something like that. And so I was trying to just kind of reverse engineer essentially what happens to people who work in intelligence after they've done that, and if I can do the same and just essentially walk backwards from what they did. And I figured out many people work actually in security consulting who did kind of intelligence, military intelligence, national intelligence type stuff. And so I started looking around in that direction and found a kind of consulting company that is in that specific space, in kind of crisis management and kind of corporate intelligence. One of the leaders, it's called Control Risks. It's I think for many people it's unknown. It's kind of a boutique with a couple of thousand people globally. And I applied there, got an internship, and then kind of transferred that into a full-time position. And while I was working there, I just found the work super interesting. Just was like I was kind of good at it, I think, and so I just enjoyed doing the security consulting work. And then I got a job at Deloitte, which was a great opportunity. I wanted to do more cybersecurity work, and Deloitte had that opportunity for me. And then at the same time, I actually applied to the German kind of foreign intelligence service, so the German CIA or the German MI6 essentially. And I got actually through kind of the whole interview round, and I got a job offer. Then you get into the kind of security clearance part, which takes almost a year, at least in my case, where they kind of go through your life. They interview people in your life, my mother, friends, all of that stuff. And during that time, I essentially got called twice by them about specific things. Once because I was making slightly more money than I would make there, which is not something they like. They give people a pay cut because it kind of makes them vulnerable to exploitation or bribery or things like that. And I told them that I met my then girlfriend, now wife, who was born in Uzbekistan, only lived there for half a year before they migrated to Germany. But Uzbekistan is on a list of the German kind of foreign intelligence service because it's a kind of close to Russia, and so essentially you can't really be married to anyone like a Uzbek national or something like that, which my wife is. But and so they essentially called me about those two things and asked like, are you sure with this lady? Do you want to stay with her? And do you want to and like with the money, we're not sure, right? If that makes sense. And I'm not sure if I didn't give satisfactory answers during those calls, because I wasn't going to commit to not seeing my girlfriend anymore, because I liked her and I think I made the right decision, having married her last year and having a 2-year-old. And then I just got a letter in the mail at some point saying that they essentially rescinded the offer. And so that kind of, for me, closed that whole idea in my life to at one point work in national intelligence. And then I just kept doing what I was doing, which is working in cybersecurity consulting, which was a ton of fun. I worked much more than in kind of cybersecurity strategy project, which was very exciting. At the time, when I first got into it, I was like, these project management office PMO type things, they're not fun, right? They're not like, I did like physical pen testing before, which is, exciting. Like you get to play burglar and break into places and stuff like that, right? But when you think about it, the strategy part was more interesting because you work on the big levers, right? So what actually protects the company is not someone doing a pen test of one specific application or pen test of a specific building, but like, where is the money allocated in the most efficient way to reduce the risk in the most efficient way, right? And so once that kind of clicked for me, I got much more interested in kind of the high level strategy work in cybersecurity, which I think got me ready to kind of move into a CISO role. And so I was doing okay at Deloitte. I think it was kind of close to the next promotion, which would have been a senior manager. And then I was thinking about family planning, and I was essentially also thinking either I'm now going to stay forever in consulting and do nothing else, or I maybe should do something in an industry role with real responsibility and do that for a bit to actually kind of understand how it feels as the person, receiving the smart advice from the consultants, and not just owning a problem for 3 months or half a year as a consultant, but rather, end to end, see what kind of my smart ideas actually end up at. And so that's when I looked around for more in-house positions and got that opportunity at Allianz Direct to join, which was back then a smallish kind of entity. In Allianz is now kind of one of the leading, I would say, digitally native entities in the Allianz group. And it was a great decision. I think it's super, super interesting. And so the CISO job has been nothing but interesting and exciting the entire time I had it. I'm very lucky to make that to have made that decision. And now, after like 3.5 years, I'm actually looking to get out of the CISO role again and move back into consulting, but this time as a freelance consultant, try to start my own kind of small consulting business and hopefully be somewhat successful in that in the next year.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful introduction, and I didn't expect that. It was packed with all the elements. I mean, this is super exciting for I think in heart of any cybersecurity professional, they always see themselves as some kind of spy. I think I wouldn't be lying if I admit that I also at some point thought that, anybody breaking into things like pen testing, they always have some kind of bent towards like a spy or, trying to uncover the unseen or, those kind of stuff. So really interesting, really insightful.
I think many people often imagine CISO's day as something straight out of a spy thriller, right? Constantly fending off hackers and tackling security threats. However, I think the reality is more complex, right? Could you walk us through what a typical day looks like for you?
For sure, for sure. I have to say, kind of battling the hackers is in fact not, thankfully, not the thing I do on a day-to-day basis. I mean, when I started in this job 3.5 years ago, it was a lot more hands-on work. So I was building essentially a completely new security function. I was the first hire in that security function and now build it up to almost 10 people. So I was, building new processes, trying to meet all the stakeholders, try to do all the risk assessments myself, try to, support pen testing is something that we outsource, right? But support that, kind of manage the vulnerabilities, support people in finding solutions for vulnerabilities, kind of all of it at the same time. And now that we have a bit more of a mature security function, essentially I'm just 1 or 2 steps removed from most of these things, right? So it's much more about kind of defining priorities for my team to work on, helping them get past roadblocks, right? Either if it's because they're internal stakeholders that maybe don't move as fast as we want them, or maybe our process isn't quite working well enough with how the business works. And so kind of, let's say, translating much more the business requirements that I have more contact with from my peers and from my kind of direct line to the board of management, into like specific tasks that my team can then execute and work with, right? I would say some of the very specific tasks are, for example, I do engage with peers, which is, for example, one of the key partners I work with is our head of DevOps. So like I said, we're fairly digitally native, so it's all cloud native infrastructure that we work on. And so a lot of the security processes that we run are kind of built on top of an existing cloud native infrastructure, which means I exchange quite often with our kind of platform engineering team or DevOps team, but also other tribe leads and people who have kind of, let's say, on my level, have responsibility in the company, then make those decisions that help my team, unblock things, help them move past things, help them be an point of escalation if that's necessary. And then there are a lot of admin stuff that comes with it, right? So I do budget planning. I set up new projects. I try to onboard consultants if we get help from them or something like that, right? Clear, like, approve invoices, what have you, right? That stuff that kind of ends up on my desk that I have to formally approve. And then incidents is still, right? So obviously I still have to manage incidents. If there's any incident that's severe enough, that's not just kind of an operational blip somewhere, then it's something that either where I then take over and work together with our CIO, or he runs the show and I try to handle the security stuff in the background. So that still, I would say, happens often enough, thankfully not every week, but often enough that it's a kind of recurring issue, I would say. And then, I mean, there's some kind of projects that I'm just actively working more content-wise on, which, for example, at the moment is the Digital Operational Resilience Act in Europe, which is a kind of new regulation coming out for financial institutions, which goes live, or I think it is officially live. It is being enforced from January 17th, I think, next year, which means every, I think, financial entity in the EU is currently scrambling to become compliant with DORA. And so we're the same. I think we're on good track there to get there, but it's still significant amount of work. So I'm now also getting closer into the content, into the details, because it's just something that's important enough for us to take care of.
That's fascinating. It really highlights how much goes on behind the scenes to keep organizations secure. I mean, it's not just about reacting to threats, but also about having a strong, proactive strategy in place.
That's kind of what I also realized, what I mentioned earlier, right? When I got into cybersecurity strategy, it's kind of this, you get to the point where you see that you actually move things ultimately, if you really get down to it, with where do you spend your money, right? And that's then at some point that just becomes the CISO's job. Obviously, like I said, there's more to it, right? But the strategic part of it, the making purposeful decisions about where you invest your time and your budget, that is ultimately the main purpose of the CISO, I would say.
Yeah, your approach clearly shows the importance of balancing immediate response with long-term planning and collaboration across the company. So it must be really challenging to stay ahead in this fast evolving landscape.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on this, because there's a lot of interesting things to unpack. For the new CISOs who are hearing to this podcast, how did you align the business side and the technical side? Because when you enter as a new CISO, there are too many things, I guess, on the plate for a CISO to plan, but to also know the current state. And I think you said that it was in its very nascent state, so you had to build the strategy ground up and so on. So what were your how did you go about it? Did you had something in mind and that changed in the face of reality, or you could go through the things as is? How was it?
No, for sure. So I came from this, I mean, consulting advisory background where essentially you do a lot of things. How you sell them and how you approach them is very academic and very textbook like, right? So essentially, if you want to understand the current state of a company, you do an assessment, you use a benchmark, or you do things like that. You do structured interviews. You then rate that in like qualitative criteria, and you come out with a maturity rating. You define the 15 projects that you work on and assign budget to them, right? Which is for a second how I thought I may run this when I joined the company, and then it turned out it would have been a complete waste of time. It's just not operate. It just didn't work the way because I had to, for one, just get started with stuff. So I didn't have time like to do a 3 month assessment. I also wouldn't have immediately had budget to like hire 3 more consultants to support me with it, right? And so I just needed to get started with fixing the various obvious issues that were there, and then at the same time kind of slowly build things into a more strategic kind of approach, which I think is not something that I at the time very purposefully planned. It's more that essentially how it turned out is that I would say the cycles just became longer. So in the beginning, I iterated very fast, did a lot of small things and changed them and set up kind of processes that just to get the basics there. And then over time, you kind of improve on those processes. I know I have the incident response plan. I know I have the kind of approach for business continuity management. I know how to manage vulnerabilities. I know how to identify them. Okay, now I need to work on, I need to make the feedback loop smaller for the developers to understand if the vulnerabilities have been fixed, or I need to improve the communication. I need to set up IAM processes beyond just a very simple access review. And so those then become kind of bigger, more complex. You kind of, the increases in maturity also become smaller with that, but it's where you have to get to at some point, right? But it was very interesting how kind of my perceived kind of understanding of the world of like owning cybersecurity responsibility clash with the reality of just there are just too many situations where you just have to get to work and just start doing stuff and just don't have time to like analyze things to death and just go with the 80% solution that's very obvious to everyone. Just do that, and then you can still come back later and improve it. And yeah, so that has been an interesting learning opportunity, but also it's exactly what I wanted out of the job, right? Like I said, I wanted to understand what it feels like to own the problem, and this was like the being thrown into the cold water situation that I definitely was looking for. So it was a great opportunity, great learning opportunity for me.
Wow, that absolutely, I can imagine that. And adding to that, there are so many departments. Being myself from this industry, I see that on a day-to-day basis, we have like legal departments, procurement, regulatory stuff, and then DevSecOps teams, and so there is for you as a CISO, there are so many threads, commanding your attention at any one given moment. How do you manage to schedule it in a way that, and how do you reprioritize? Because if there is an incident, probably it calls for attention. If there is a third party, probably arrangement, or if there are some, legal disclosures or things like that, that there are, everything seems important, but there is a rule that if everything is important, there's nothing important. So somehow we have to set priorities. What do you use as a yardstick for yourself? Like, or is there a, like, maybe probably you defined it yourself, because as you said, you build the system ground up, maybe you define some strategies to prioritize things in some order to, juggle with them at the same moment, at least some of them.
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, there's a, this has also been an interesting learning opportunity in the past when I was working with kind of leaders, senior leaders. You get to know the situation where you just have to pull on them all the time because you feel like they don't have their calendar under control, they don't have their inbox under control, which I just, to be honest, turns out, yes, that's true, right? So they're essentially situations that are sometimes just managed by who screams the loudest. At the moment, it's I'm thankfully in a situation where I have a fairly well set up team that's I would say I was lucky enough to hire well and find good, smart people who just take ownership for their problems and then come to me with the things they need help with, or they think they should want my opinion on, which is all great and something I definitely want. But I don't need to hold their hands day to day, right? And so that makes kind of the running those processes, many of them are essentially, they're not necessarily running by themselves, but if I were gone for 2 weeks on vacation or something, nothing would burn to the ground, right? And that's a very great situation to be in. There were a couple of growing pains, I would say, in the very beginning, where we didn't have any security function. People didn't know I existed, so there wasn't a lot of people coming to me and wanting stuff from me, right? But then there was essentially an intermediate period where I kind of build up the processes well enough for people to be aware that they need my support, or my team's support, but I didn't have the whole team staffed. So that just means like there was much more chaos. And so now that thankfully is not the case. I think that's a difficult situation for essentially like SME, so small, medium companies to work with, because they don't have a 50, 100-person security function that captures like, people going on vacation, someone being on parental leave, CISO being offline for 2 weeks because they also need to take vacations, right? But there's just a situation where you always have to be on, kind of, and that's still partially the case for me, where if I go on vacation, of course I need to take my phone with me, right? And of course I also take my laptop with me, because there may be an incident where I do need to go online. And so it's still there, but it's thankfully much less hectic than it used to be a couple months or 1 or 2 years back.
Nice to hear that. Of course, we can imagine the effort that goes into it. So if a company is running smooth enough and you can go on vacations, hopefully uninterrupted, then it's that's good news always. And with the recent surveys and news about all the regulatory and some pressure building up on the CISOs, which has increased, I guess, significantly, with the demand akin to a superhero, like from the CISOs, all the time, that they have to be aware of multiple topics, and also in case of incidents, they have to be responsible for the disclosures. So given these growing personal liabilities, what step would you recommend to the CISOs to take to protect themselves?
Sure. So I think for anybody, especially essentially for people starting as a first-time CISO, either themselves or being the first CISO in an organization where maybe some of those processes are not set up, the board of management may not be aware of the personal liability issues that CISOs are facing. I think there are a couple of basics that you can look into, which I think the very basic thing that everybody I'm sure has heard is D&O insurance, so directors and officers insurance, right? I'm lucky enough, so I work in an insurance company, so a lot of those things we have good enough coverage there for all our kind of leadership functions. But there was a question that came up in our CISO community in Allianz as well, because of course people are worried. I think that's essentially to cover the legal side. I think you probably would have to look into the specific coverage of the policy to make sure that, for example, you're not only covered as being an employee of the company, right? So there may be a situation where you are fired and afterwards become part of a lawsuit. You just left the company and become part of a lawsuit afterwards, or as part of the lawsuit, the company fired you or had to fire you. And so having that policy that ensures that you're still covered under that D&O insurance for any work that you have done in the past as an officer of that company, that I think would be important, right? Because otherwise it may become pointless to have that insurance in place. But I think beyond that, what I've seen in many of those cases is that, to be honest, I think there were 1 or 2 cases, right? I think that it's at the moment, I think they happened in the same year, and so people are a bit excited and a bit worried, but I'm not sure if it's a trend yet. So I guess we have to see, right, how that plays out in the future. What it looked like is that there may be essentially some visibility issues or transparency issues that were there in those companies, and not necessarily at the fault of the CISO, or maybe even out of kind of interest of the CISO to do a good job or to kind of support their board of management by maybe abstracting away some issues for them. I think the visibility and transparency to provide to kind of make the board of management understand what the issues are that the company is facing, while not being kind of overly panicky about it. I think that's an important kind of, I would say, soft skill that plays a big part in that, because if you create the transparency and the visibility into these issues and at the same time explain which ones are actually important, which ones can be solved in which time frame, what's kind of the financial investment that you need to make, which are kind of the other initiatives that the company is working on, at the same time how they may be affected, put that into the context that the board of management can understand, then I think there is interest from boards of management to understand these issues, because they are ultimately liable for them. So it's not a viable tactic for directors of a company, so for boards of management, to just say, I don't want to hear it, don't tell me about it, because they're ultimately going to be liable anyway. So it generally, at least that's also been my experience with the board members I've worked with, that they want to know about the problems. They just don't want you just dump them on their desk and walk away and say, so find someone to take care of it, right? So I think that's an important cultural aspect to that, which without obviously knowing any of the CISOs and the specifics of the situations where they were indicted or not indicted, it's just something that I feel like sometimes people either don't feel like they can create the transparency because maybe people don't want to hear it, or they don't do it in a way that is actionable. And then that becomes a problem where they either maybe own the problem themselves because they didn't tell anyone about it, or no one will listen to them anymore because they just yell panic all the time, right? And so I think that's an important part.
That's great. So just to summarize, so because there was a lot of information here and a lot of key important points that you mentioned. So have the directors and officers insurance, and maybe have contact with some legal lawyer or something to, look out for the golden parachute. I read that sometime back, some kind of terms in your, like you mentioned, after resigning, what would be the condition? Maybe continue with the insurance for 1 or 2 years more, even after being fired from the position, and the cause of the fire, and going to the intricacies basically with the lawyer probably. And then also as soon as possible, be very transparent, or have that communication line with the board, so they are at all times aware, because ultimately, like you mentioned, they are also liable for these kind of attacks. And it's always good to have that communication, that fluid communication with the board, and have their buy-in is like crucial, and not try to shadow or just make more clear communication, to make the facts known as and when they happen.
Yeah, absolutely. The way I see and understand the current regulatory changes that are happening is not so much that the regulators want every company to fix every single problem down to the smallest kind of vulnerability that is never going to be exploited out of a lab situation, but rather that a robust risk management system needs to be in place, right? So people the organization needs to be able to identify, assess, and manage their risks, and that includes communication and awareness on kind of senior leadership level, right? And that is not like, that sounds super easy, right? And I can draw a flowchart that simplifies that, but obviously communicating those things, aggregating risks in a sensible way, then prioritizing where to spend the money on those things, that's super complicated, right? That's the whole point of what information security does. So it's not a trivial task, but that's kind of, if you get to that kind of process where you have robust risk management in place, and there's an understanding of how you manage your risks, that's the way it currently looks. If it's explainable well enough, then the regulator will also not throw anyone in jail, right? But again, I guess also depends a bit on the country. In Europe, that's the way it looks like. I don't know how the SEC is going forward with their kind of approach to cybersecurity regulation and cybersecurity enforcement, right? So I take that a bit with a grain of salt, but that's kind of how it looks for me at the moment.
So incident response is a vital aspect of CISO's role, so particularly in today's evolving threat landscape. So considering the recent CrowdStrike Microsoft security incident that happened, What key lessons do you think organizations can take away to prevent similar breaches in the future?
So I think I may have a slightly disappointing answer, but so I think the first part is that one of the key things that I learned is that everybody depends on Microsoft, and I would like to see the company that has an exit plan from Microsoft as a vendor that can be executed in less than 5 years. And I think the second part would be that you need to understand your critical vendor dependencies. I think it wouldn't have even mattered all that much in this very specific incident, but it's still still critical, and it's the way we currently do as an industry, in my view, how we do third-party risk management or third-party cyber risk management is kind of broken. I would also say it's a very hard problem, but it's also the way we currently approach it feels more like security theater and not much like actual risk mitigation in many cases. But we do these, we send these questionnaires to our partners, ask them to fill them out and let us know, do you have an ISMS certified according to ISO 27000, or do you have whatever SOC 2 something audit that you can show me? Just anecdotally, I recently, after not this CrowdStrike related thing, but another kind of third party near miss incident that we recently had, our board of management essentially reached out to me and a couple other people, so like our CIO, for example, and some other senior leaders, and essentially asked us to look closer into how we do third-party risk management and go beyond a bit what DORA already requires as a new regulation, which puts a lot of focus on third-party risk management, and just look beyond that and look more on an operational level and how can we actually mitigate those things, how we can manage incidents better, have more transparency into these things. And so one of the things I did was reach out to one of the major cloud security providers, cloud service providers, and set up a call with them and just wanted to understand how they do third-party risk management, because they generally seem to have that under control. And I got a few interesting learnings from them. So, for example, that generally the first approach is to build something in-house and not buy it. Secondly, and so essentially, if you want to buy something, you need to go through a different approval chain, and you need to calculate into the budget for buying something that there needs to be security due diligence that has to be done on those things, and probably also privacy and legal due diligence. So it's all part of the business case of acquiring a new vendor, a new tool, or something like that. Which I think is an interesting approach and kind of also very governance heavy, which is great to see, right? It's not magic kind of AI whatever tooling, but it's just like hard, strict governance. But then also 2 weeks later, we got a notification from them that one of their sub providers was breached, right? So where you essentially, like, they do, I would say, probably not everything, but almost everything right? And they have a very strict approach to it and have this built into how they run their company philosophically and culturally, everything, and still they still have these issues, right? And they still have exposure from those third-party risks. And so I think the disappointing answer is probably you're not going to prevent those things. If you're exposed well enough with vendors and you use third parties to the degree that many companies are doing at the moment, then I think it's a matter of time until you're breached to some degree through a vendor, through a third party. And I think the CrowdStrike incident even was, even though it was kind of reported on as a security incident, was not a security incident, right? It was not there was no breach. It was an operational IT failure, I would say, right? Which is something I think CrowdStrike managed fairly well from how they communicated it, how they mitigated it. It was just super severe, of course, and very newsworthy. And so I think that's why it got kind of published. But I think we had many more kind of vendor-related real breaches, like SolarWinds or something like that, right? That was really bad and really kind of exposed many companies to real nation state attackers and real kind of significant data loss, which in this case, you can argue which is worse, right? In this case, it was just an operational outage and not, the Russian state-sponsored hackers getting access to like the personal data of whatever, every US citizen or every Australian citizen or something like that. So I would say, to be honest, as a consumer, I'd rather prefer my kind of local train station not having their computers working for a day instead of, you know, some criminal having access to all my personal data.
Absolutely. It's and the points that you mentioned about developing things in-house, I think that's always it's a very interesting finding. And also there was an incident sometime back, well, not an incident, but a discussion rather in our company to discuss with the architects, because you know these off-the-shelf solutions, usually they are not so adaptable. They don't integrate so well into your infrastructure, and you have to look at the architectural complexities, because sometimes a simple update like what happened here in case of, you know, the CrowdStrike incident could literally like without testing and integrating into your environments could be quite complicated. And we suffered like months of not downtime, but you know, like adapting to the updates and fitting it in with the infrastructure. It's really complicated sometimes with the off the shelf solutions, the third party solutions. So in-house could really be a good approach if it's feasible in the given scenario. So that's a good.
And then I think you come back to the problem that many companies still are not built as, or it may not be a problem, right? But many companies are not software companies, right? I mean, so even like I think there are some you know good even financial services companies that really lean into being kind of technology first companies. I think ourselves at Allianz Direct, I see that, and that's very interesting to experience, right? To be in the kind of have an understanding as an organization and not just doing the business you're in. So for us, being an insurance company, so being good at pricing of insurance products, being good at handling claims, all of those things, but also being good at the technology side. But and so even for us, we need to depend on third parties where we have a fairly good capability to actually build products in-house. I think many companies, and if I look at Germany, we have a large base of kind of mid to larger size companies that are kind of industrial products or, you know, automotive parts that are like not, they haven't been like digital companies ever, right? And they now slowly migrate, and for them digital evolution is something like rolling out Microsoft 365, right? That's like the big change in the organization, and getting to like deploying software products all the time, doing that securely, doing that reliably, doing that in like, you know, don't just deploy changes twice a year, but do that 15 times a day. Those types of things, they're a million miles away from that, right? And so for those, they need to depend on the vendors, because building a chat platform for like Slack in-house is never achievable for a company like that, right? And so it's very, I think it's very difficult if you have the capabilities in-house to build stuff instead of buying it. Cool, right? If you do it better than the people you buy it from, but at the same time, it's, if you don't do it better, then you know you need to put your trust somewhere. Either you put it in your employees or you put it in your partner. If I think the partner can do it cheaper and better, why hire the people in-house? So
yeah, that's an interesting take, because it's true that they are not, all companies are not technology first, and with infrastructure companies and so on, it's like given that they would go for the approach of, you know, getting third-party software or buying the off-the-shelf functionalities. And also in case of technology-first companies, that, you know, it's Allianz, ING, and JP Morgan and such. So because these companies, even though you have the resources to do so, it should also align with the, you know, business goal. There are some tools, in fact, internally available sometimes to the companies, but we have to evaluate the time and the effort, that if we need 5 years to develop, can we really wait that long? And, you know, is it really beneficial to also go that path? And why do that, you know, all those kind of factoring in all those things. So it's a really complicated decision, I can imagine, to make even for technology first companies. So yeah,
for sure. And I think that's I think that has been the interesting discussion around kind of using cloud in the past. I mean, I hope that discussion is now kind of past, and everybody kind of understand that there's a benefit of using cloud service providers, and it's not just someone else's computer, right? But it's been normal for companies to run their own exchange service forever, right? And it's now like, why would you, right? So Microsoft does it for you. They patch it automatically. And well, talking about Microsoft kind of security culture, different thing. But in general, I think companies are much more prone to miss an update, misconfigure Microsoft Exchange in some horrible way that opens it up for attackers, instead of just buying the cloud service, and then focus on if the companies should focus on their digital capabilities, but then focus on the ones that actually enable your business, like you said, and not have people figure out how to run a mail server, right? Because everybody needs a mail server. You can buy it commercially off the shelf for super cheap. You don't need to worry about uptime. It's all done for you, and then by focus on whatever, managing your warehouse operations better, or in our case, digitally improving your claims journey, or all the things, right? And so then, I think obviously then security needs to attach to those things, right? And figure out if you need to buy more off the shelf, beef up your third-party risk management approach, figure out how to do it in a kind of risk mitigating way, not just a kind of compliance checkbox approach. And if you actually do build stuff in-house, then you need to focus on application security at the same time, do that better and get into it and get closer to the technology.
Absolutely. And considering how crucial it is to manage and evaluate the effectiveness of all these processes, third parties, and even in-house enterprise security frameworks, and how is it working? What do you use to measure the KPIs? And do you customize them if they feel too rigid or prescriptive? And which ones have been actually proven useful to you, and which one you discarded or are not so effective? And why do you think so?
So I mean, I'm in a, let's say, sometimes blissful, sometimes kind of restricting situation where, as part of a wider group, there are certain security KPIs that I just have to take over because all the entities in our group need to follow the same KPI framework. So kind of on group level, there can be some kind of comparison about how we're doing security-wise, right? And some benchmarking. And so there are certain KPIs that I just take as is and I need to report on, and that's not a question for me. I think I personally like KPIs that don't necessarily focus on just measuring process maturity or something abstract like that, but rather that are tied directly to essentially capabilities that reduce the risk of the cybersecurity breaches. So either kind of the impact of an incident or the likelihood of that happening. And I found so Phil Venables is the CISO of Google Cloud. He has a great blog where he writes about kind of cybersecurity strategy and also a lot of things around it. Let's maybe call it politics, so interpersonal things around cybersecurity leadership. But also he wrote a couple of things around metrics and KPIs, and he has a kind of cool and interesting metrics framework where he said essentially if he needed 3 metrics that he could, if he needed to only essentially use 3 metrics to measure a cybersecurity program, I think I hope I'm paraphrasing this correctly. He has 3 he uses. So it's one, software reproducibility. So essentially how reliably can I essentially recreate the same piece of software as it's running currently in production? Because if I can do that very reliably, I don't care about the state of the thing running in production. If there's any fault, I just kill it, redeploy it. It's exactly the same, right? And that gives me a lot of kind of flexibility and speed when reacting to incidents, reacting to attacks. So I think that's a very interesting measurement to take. Second one is cold start recovery time. So essentially, how fast can you essentially recover from an incident? Includes like getting data back into the application or database recovered from whatever state it was. And also again, your application essentially deployed in the way they need to be. Also, I think that both of those things focus more on the resilience aspect that you need to look at security through, right? So it's not enough anymore to just measure vulnerability remediation times or something like that, or vulnerability remediation compliance. You need to go a step beyond and measure how well can you actually respond to things, and how well are you prepared, and how much can you mitigate actually an attack and kind of the blast radius of an attack. And the last one you mentioned was data governance coverage, which essentially is like how much of your data do you have certain pieces of information about, which is like, what is the data, right? So what's the thing that we're actually collecting there? Is it, for example, super sensitive, or is it not sensitive? Who owns it? Where is it? What's the origin of it? Who has access to it? You know, those kind of things. And if you measure those three things, which is, again, it sounds trivial, I think it's very difficult to implement that well. But if you measure those three different things, you have essentially, for one, proven a lot of control over your environment, which is super important now, right? It's not just, like, again, it's not enough to just show how much vulnerability scanning you do or how many people click or not click on phishing emails. All great and important, and the hygiene things you need to do, right? But it goes beyond that. And it also, very, very interestingly, these are all things that have huge business benefits beyond security, where essentially security is just a fringe benefit of those things, right? So if I have super reliable software reproducibility, that's something that's super important for me operationally as an organization to be able to deploy changes reliably, right? Which is something that is great for security, which I can talk about in a second when how we handled Log4Shell. For me, that was kind of an aha moment. It's like the security aspect is cool, but you get so much more business benefit out of it, which means like you can deploy changes faster, which means you can react faster to customer demands, which means you can outperform your competitors, which means more market share. And so it's a lot of kind of business benefits that you gotta get out of it, where you can then just attach kind of your security requirements and get your security benefits out of it as well. And so for us, I learned that essentially and kind of fell in love with the whole cloud native and DevOps kind of world when I was almost a year, a bit more than half a year into my CISO role when Log4Shell happened in December 2021. I also just came out of surgery that day, nothing important, but I was kind of still a bit drowsy. And so I got the notification on Friday afternoon that essentially something weird is happening. It's like there's a super important vulnerability everybody needs to work on. And we essentially deployed a fix to all our own applications within 48 hours over the weekend without any kind of manual intervention from anyone. And I think we took 48 hours because one service took a lot of time to restart. And I think we could have done it probably in 6, but it was just more, we did it sequentially to check if something breaks, right? So we were kind of careful about it, and still it took us only 2 days. And so that was a moment where we were done after 2 days. We saw other organizations actually still finding out if they were exposed, right? If they had any Java services that might be exposed. And so there was a moment where essentially we could only do that because we had so much trust in our software reproducibility, right? Because we knew if we deployed this minor fix that was kind of provided by the open source community, we knew if it breaks something, we can revert. And at the same time, if it doesn't break something, or if it would break something, we would find out pretty immediately. Because we have this kind of reliable testing infrastructure, we have this kind of reliable deployment processes, and these reliable metrics and reliable observability, all of those things that have nothing to do with security in the first approach, because this wasn't done by the security team. This was done by our platform engineering team, right? They built all of this. And I was just essentially sitting there watching it happen and kind of getting us more and more secure as an organization, while just kind of running through a normal change process for them, just on the weekend. So not that normal, but the process in and of itself was super standard. And that was very exciting, and something where I saw like, okay, this is how you need to do it. There's no other way. Because you get so much security out of it. At the same time, the organization is so much faster, so much more kind of viable as a competitor in the marketplace. So yeah, great experience for me.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, 2 things stood out to me. That first of all, you did it in 48 hours. It's commendable, because I've seen, like you say, discussions like past months, into Log4Shell, and I could see people still struggling. It's also because oftentimes it's, of course, it was a critical vulnerability that needed an instant patch, but also people get into the cycle of, if they can break something, like you said, you had everything set up, the observability, the traceability, and you always knew you could go back and forth, and you had the trust in your software engineers that that enabled you to go ahead with the plan, which is crucial. And also the other point that I love is that you said that you highlighted the metrics and you link them to the outcome, business outcomes, because every time we do that, it potentially drives first the buying probably from the the board, because for them, if we say we fixed X number of vulnerabilities and these are the remaining, it could be a metric, but it's not really adding in value, as opposed to saying if our product is down, it could be back within these number of hours because we have so and so many things. So every time we are attaching some metric to a business outcome, it is so much understandable for the rest of the people, and also drives so much value. And oftentimes security is sometimes seen as a hindrance or like a stopper, and this really reinforces like the trust of people into security. That's really an enabler rather than the other way around. So that's great.
For sure, if you do it well, I think it can be significantly enabling for the business to do what they need to do, right? And it's not like none of the people on the board of management I've spoken to, and I've deal with them somewhat regularly, none of them don't care about security. They all care about it. It's not the first thing many of them think about when they get up in the morning, because they have their other priorities, but none of them think it's unimportant, right? And so if you connect that to what they need to achieve, and you can support them in what they need to achieve while using the security levers that you have, and showing to them that you protect bad things from happening to help them achieve their goals, or you can actually make them achieve their goals faster, that of course is kind of where you want to go. There are still times where you have to say, sorry, there's this weird compliance process we need to implement. It's clunky and we don't really have a smarter way to do it. We'll just have to do it like this for now. If we find something better, we'll do it obviously like that, but for now we have to live with this. But obviously try to keep these occasions to a minimum and try to focus on the business enabling things, of course.
Amazing.
So on the topic of advancements, in your experience as a CISO, how has AI transformed your approach to cybersecurity? And what do you see as the biggest benefits and risk associated with AI-powered tech solutions?
Another maybe disappointing answer. I'm a bit off the AI hype train at the moment. It's been, I think the last year, I think may have been more than a year now since kind of the first ChatGPT became public. I think in the beginning it was crazy exciting. It was also like, as everyone else, it was thinking, wow, this is a huge game changer. It's going to do all the entirety of my job is going to be done by this thing in 5 years, and I'm not, I'm going to be either useless, or I'm only going to do all the cool things, and this thing is going to do all the boring stuff for me. But now, kind of, I'm not quite seeing the business benefits that we all assume were coming. I think many businesses are still struggling. So I would say non-AI businesses. I think there are many kind of AI product companies that maybe just wrappers around a ChatGPT or an OpenAI API, but that of course for them this is all great and super important. But for, let's say, traditional businesses like financial service institutions, or kind of fast-moving consumer goods companies, or whatever kind of organizations, I think they're still struggling a bit to find these great Gen AI use cases, right? I think in security this is very similar. I've seen a couple things that are interesting and promising. So one thing that I see could be a real benefit is essentially enabling security operations center analysts to make queries faster and easier, right? So you just don't have to write some complicated SQL query, but rather just ask the tool, hey, give me all the endpoints that have this version of Microsoft Office installed and that had recent connections from this IP range or whatever, right? So, and either it gives you the query for you to put in, or you just does the thing for you, right? And comes back, and then you can ask it more and say, okay, now give me all the endpoints of that population that had this specific person log into them or something, right? And so I think that could be a very cool kind of evolution in how security operations center are running. And it's I think one of the the most overloaded capabilities in security at the moment, where people get so much data thrown at them, have so little time to respond to it, and there's so much opportunity for important stuff to get missed, right? And so essentially, if you have, if you increase the leverage of every individual person by making them work faster or smarter with these tools, I think that's great. That's a great opportunity. The thing is, I haven't seen that like live in many products, and we use some somewhat advanced kind of security tooling that you would expect that to come to fairly soonish, but still it's not, I haven't seen that like widely adopted yet. And beyond that, I think there's a lot of still like machine learning stuff that hasn't worked that well, to be honest, over the past 10 years already. So specifically, same problem, like machine learning used to be kind of the great solution for all our SOC issues, right? For all the kind of overloading of our SOC analysts and all the kind of context switching that they need to, machine learning is going to do the thing, because it's just going to tell you the important anomalies, right? It's going to tell you if someone logs in from Singapore and New York within 5 minutes of each other on the same account. I've seen these alerts. They're kind of pointless many times, because it's an underlying kind of data quality issue where the system doesn't know that someone uses a VPN, or the system doesn't understand that someone maybe is actually in Singapore but connects to a data center somewhere in the US, which then gets the system is confused. I get an alert that our CEO has this impossible travel kind of alert on his identity, and I then need to look into it, right? And so I'm not yet I feel like we should probably figure out how to do ML a bit better, or well, to be fair, the software vendors need to figure it out a bit better. And maybe then I can see the Gen AI stuff also doing more, right, and being more beneficial. But at the moment, it's just not reliable enough, right? It just produces too much garbage that comes out of it for such an important task. If you want to produce like LinkedIn content with it, cool, right? Go ahead. I think it can be useful for that, to kind of bounce ideas off of something, right? Or just create something. I think we also use it in some cases to like create some quick compliance documentation, or if you want to create a new guideline that you don't immediately know how to structure it, you ask the Gen AI to maybe help you with that, right? So that's all great, but it's not it saves me 20 minutes, right? It doesn't save me actually like 80% of my working time. And so there, I'm not yet convinced. I'm waiting for the game changer there, I would say. And on the threat side, I think it's interesting. I'm also not yet seeing what has been promised by every kind of threat intelligence organization out there, that the attackers becoming more sophisticated, that they use much more sophisticated malware, that they use more sophisticated phishing attacks, or that they use more people have access to somewhat sophisticated attacks. I'm not yet seeing that. It's been promised by everyone, and everybody assumes it happens and makes sense to me, right? But it's not. I've not seen any evidence of this so far, and so that's where I can see that happening in the future. Again, if the AI tooling gets better, in this case, of course, worse for us, but kind of more powerful for the attackers, and that's a potentially big risk, because honestly, catching phishing emails at the moment is still pretty easy, because for some reason people still haven't found out how to do spell check on their phishing emails. But otherwise, it's I'm cautiously waiting for like this big boom of AI powered attacks. To be fair, deepfakes have been happening more, right? And so that is kind of scary, because that has been working successfully in some organizations, where I think it was a case in Hong Kong, where there was essentially a deepfake created video call, where someone then wired significant amount of money because they thought they were speaking to the CFO of their organization in a Zoom call or in a Teams call or something like that. And that is, if those kind of video generating AI solutions get better, that is scary. But again, it's I'm not seeing that broad adoption of it yet, where everybody is running scared. So yeah, it's something we need to manage, no question. But thankfully, we're not being kind of overrun by the hordes of AI-powered script kiddies yet.
Where do you see the, I mean, is it more is it creating more opportunity, or are we seeing, I think you say that threats are not yet so advanced, like we are saying that it's powering some kind of, making them even stronger, but we don't see any use case, at least not now, luckily, that proves that, no, go ahead and proves their capability in the sense that it enables you, like you said, it could save maybe, I don't know, 5-10% of your time, but not 80%. It's not yet there to give that leverage either way, like to use it, of course, wherever there's huge amount of data, it can always process it, but then we won't be sure how well it is, if it is a false positive or it is hallucinating on the, the data, or we need to train enough the models to be sure that, with human feedback and so on, to be sure if we can really rely on some critical data, giving AI that data. And we are not yet there, I guess, now that we can completely rely on it to give us some, maybe they can assist people to be a bit faster, but not completely remove the human from the loop, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is where it's headed. And I think at the very beginning, I was, let's say, worried a bit that this is actually going to essentially take over humans' job. I think it is actually really, at least in the near future, it looks much more like a support function that makes people tiny bit smarter, tiny bit faster, which is great, right? I think this is obviously good. And on the defensive side, definitely something that we can use, right? Because I think, especially also coming back to maybe not huge companies like Allianz, like JP Morgan, like ING, right? Where there are people who have to do much more with much less. Where you have a security team of 3 people for an organization of 5,000 people, right? And you need to somehow do that. I think that's a great opportunity there, right? For kind of AI-powered tools to increase the capabilities of those smaller teams. But then again, it needs to happen. It needs to come from somewhere. And I think the way it looks for me at the moment is that the security product vendors also don't trust the AI models enough to just put it into their tools, right? And let it essentially say, here, just click on this button, it's going to do it for you, right? Because it's not reliable enough.
Right. And apart from AI, do you think there are any other significant trends driving the future of cybersecurity, like quantum computing or something else that you see is very interesting?
So I think so quantum computing is one of those things. I think that's my personal perspective. Is obviously something we need to solve somehow, and I think we probably need to start solving it soonish, because it's obviously, I think that's been clear to most people who've looked into that, that people can now start collecting kind of encrypted data, right, and then decrypt it in 10 years or in 20 years or whenever they have access to a quantum computer that's powerful enough. So I think there needs to be, not sure if it's the most urgent thing that people need to work on right now, but it's probably something that some smart people need to work on, and I'm sure many smart people are already working on it, right? And so it's not something that's like super high on my priority list, but at the moment I'm a bit kind of, let's say, trusting in the system that someone is worrying about it enough that I can benefit from that down the line. And for me, personally, I think in security, I see just more a necessity of more culture shift. So I think talking about kind of how security is supposed to enable the business and security needs to get closer to the business, I think those discussions have been going on probably for longer than I've been working. So I think that's generally great and beneficial. I just don't see it yet quite happening. So I think there's still too many security organizations and security teams that are seeing themselves as removed from the business and kind of not keeping up with the technological advancements that many other organizations or parts of the organizations and functions are taking part in. So as an example, one of the things I'm super interested in kind of looking at closer, and I'm already following quite closely, is GRC engineering, which essentially tries to combine kind of the engineering strides that we took in like DevOps, platform engineering, and also to a certain degree DevSecOps, and apply that to GRC problems, so to governance, risk, and compliance problems. And because I think already in DevSecOps we're not doing great. I think we're still pretty far away from where DevOps or kind of platform engineering or site reliability engineering teams are at the moment, because they're working super close together with the people who build the product, which also means they're working super close with the people who run the business, right? Because there's much more understanding now that software developers, software engineers need to work together with product owners and people in the business who understand the customer demands. And on the infrastructure side, essentially, which used to be far away, right, they also understand they need to get closer to that to kind of reliably run the infrastructure. And security is trying to kind of follow and say, oh yeah, DevSecOps is kind of, we're trying to get in the middle of that whole DevOps thing, right? And just don't forget security, right? But the cultural shift that comes along with it of like owning part of the solution and not just raising issues, I think it hasn't quite registered yet. And I think governance, risk, and compliance is even farther away, where there's too much still run in spreadsheets and too much still run like by culturally by people who look at who don't understand how the business on a technology side essentially functions, right? And that's a problem. And I think GRC engineering as a discipline is trying to kind of bridge that, right? And get GRC closer to how the rest of the kind of technology organization works. And I think that's a great idea. And I think that's something where you can get a lot of benefit out of it, because compliance efforts can really slow an organization down, right? Because it's something where you need to have usually broad coverage of things, you need to do, let's say, asset management as a problem, right? It's super hard to do well if you don't have control, essentially apply this control or this measure across the entire organization, right? Because you need to know every piece of software that exists, and we need to know every single piece of compute workload that either exists in the cloud or physically somewhere on premise. You need to be aware of all the things, which is obviously a hard problem, right? And if you look at this just from I'm gonna send an email out once a year to all the leaders in the organization to please send me a spreadsheet back and tell me what are all the computers that you own, is not the way you can run this, right? It's not a sustainable way to run a business. It's going to create so much toil on the security team side, because they need to collect all of these things, need to run after the people who didn't respond. On the other side, the people then need to go and like find out, is this server mine, or do I need to ask someone else? And so I mean, this is, I think, a solved problem in many organizations now, or at least the technology is there, but still it's something where we can kind of see that this just using the standard solutions of like, making people fill out questionnaires, keeping stuff in spreadsheets, throwing stuff in presentations, and then giving this to auditors once a year, is just not the way you can run this anymore. You need to get closer to how the software is deployed, how it's built, and understand how you can apply your GRC processes there. And I think that's a cool development. I see that more and more also on LinkedIn. There are a couple of people who write some interesting stuff about that. And I see, I would like to see more of that type of, let's say, problem solving in security in general, but also in other risk functions, where you just think of the issue more with an engineering mindset, and not just from I have this problem, I have this solution to it, so I have my hammer and I'm just going to look for all the nails I can hit with it.
I have to go read a bit more about GRC engineering, but that sounds super interesting, because I think this is one of the areas which is less looked upon and done in very traditional ways. So looks like an area where there's a lot of opportunity to improve.
So what advice would you offer to someone aspiring to become a CISO? In your view, like, what are the most important skills and knowledge areas for a CISO to be successful?
Yeah, I think there So I do have to also preface this. I think there are different paths to becoming a CISO, right? I took a certain approach, which I've seen with other people, right? So first doing consulting for a bit and then jumping into a CISO position. I think it's not unheard of. I think it's a somewhat common approach. So this may be an option for many people, right? But I think there are a couple of, let's say, hard and soft skills that really help just with either getting the job or then also being successful in the job, which I think for one, kind of on the non-technical side, I think it helps to understand the business environment that you operate in, right? And the trade-offs that the company has to make or you yourself have to make between security and other priorities, to be at the very least aware of them, to then have an kind of informed, unemotional discussion about it and not be offended when people don't want to immediately fix all the security issues, right? I think that's to have that kind of take a step out of your own specific position a bit and just have a bit of empathy with the people around you and their priorities. And then I think storytelling to a certain degree helps. And I don't mean like overly verbose kind of, having these long-winded explanations of things, but rather have a structured way of explaining the things that you want people to understand, right? Either why you want more budget or why you want to fund a specific initiative, or why you want support from a specific peer of yourself or from a certain function. And I also don't mean like using metaphors all the time, which I think is a bit overused in security because it's sometimes feels a bit like people don't understand what we're talking about. And I think people understand much better if you explain it well enough. And it may mean, you have to learn how to write a PowerPoint slide deck in a certain structure that people understand what you're telling them, right? Not so much, I don't mean, the whole McKinsey powered steering committee thing. We spend 15 evenings just on one slide headline discussion type thing, but rather just craft it in a way that is understandable for people that don't work on your problem day to day, right? I think that again goes just back to empathy, right? You just need to be able to understand, put yourself in the mindset of other people that you want your problem to be understood by. And I think one other thing is identifying issues without looking at the process on how they're being solved is kind of pointless. So one of the great examples is vulnerability management and vulnerability scanning. I still see vulnerability scanning vendors advertising their great prowess in identifying all the vulnerabilities, which I care very little about at this point. I care much more about how can you help me communicate them and how can you help my peers and my colleagues fix them better, right? And I think that's working on that process to essentially reduce the cycle time, reduce the amount of work in progress that's essentially in the middle of between identification and closing. That is something that I think many people don't spend enough time on, and that's something that actually improves processes, right? And so those are a bit just, let's say, mindset or approach type things that have nothing to do with your security skills, right? That's just generally, I think, helpful as a person, as a manager in any capacity to become somewhat good at. And then from a security capability standpoint, I think it helps to be somewhat well-rounded, right? I mean, it doesn't have to mean that you have done everything under the sun. But if you've done pen testing primarily in your past, I think spending time on GRC tasks and looking into the hard problems there and understanding why they're difficult and also why they're interesting and getting kind of into that, finding them interesting, I think is an important point. Because if you only find pen testing interesting, I think becoming a CISO is not the right job. Right, because you're not going to do pen testing all the time. You're going to do some of that, right? But you're also going to spend a lot of time talking about control frameworks and how to kind of optimize that and how to, again, whatever. You have to prepare some steering committee for your great kind of security change investment. You need to work on those things and also be able to find that stuff interesting, because if you don't find it interesting, it's kind of hard to become good at something, right? And so you need to obviously become somewhat proficient. Yeah, and then I think there are a couple of business fundamentals that people just need to know, which I don't think are super hard. I think that sometimes this like feels esoteric to some people and kind of feels super complex. I've like I've studied some finance related stuff in university, and I've looked into like getting my finance knowledge a bit up there over the past couple of years. I almost don't use any of that in my day-to-day work, right? It's really much more about like I kind of need to be able to explain why I want to spend money on things, right? So I need to understand what's an FTE, so full-time equivalent, like how many people do I plan, what do I want them to work on, and what do I actually need money for? Again, explain that in a way that people can follow your thought process, right? If you just talk about NIST capabilities, NIST cybersecurity framework capabilities, good, right? I think that sometimes helps, but I think you also then need to break it down in a way that other people also understand it. Like, how many full-time equivalents do you need to hire for what function? What's the purpose of that? And so that I think getting those business fundamentals down is not crazy hard, but it's something that people should probably spend time on.
So basically, both technical skills and strategic leadership is important. And to be successful, you need to have a blend of both deep cybersecurity knowledge with strong communication and relationship building abilities, right?
For sure, for sure. I think if you have, I think any kind of leadership responsibility, right? The technical skills are important to get you there, and it's important to kind of keep your team in check. Sounds a bit mean, but essentially to make sure that your team is working in the right direction, right? But ultimately, I think the communication skills is what gets you and them over the line, right? What makes stuff actually run in the end, because you don't do it in a silo, right? You need to work with other people, and if they always dread the security people coming around the corner and wanting stuff from them and bothering them without trying to understand what their issues are, then you're not going to be very effective. I think effectiveness is the ultimate measure, right? It's the kind of empathy and those things. I think they're good just as being a kind of somewhat pleasant human being, right, to be around. But it's also just makes you more effective as a leader, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. The role seems very dynamic, so you definitely need different aspects. Yeah.
Yes.
That's very valuable insight. Thank you for sharing that.
Do you have any books, courses, or resources you'd recommend, or what are your go-to resources to follow up, to stay abreast with the latest developments for a CISO role? Because it's too demanding and you have to be aware about too many topics. So what would you recommend our viewers?
Yeah, so I like to listen to podcasts. I sometimes also listen to audiobooks, and I still read books on my Kindle, right? To like kind of business books or topics about books about security. But just to keep up to date, I have two podcasts I would recommend directly, which is like, for one, the Google Cloud Security podcast I really like. They're just I think they explain some cloud security related topics very, very well. There's also, by the way, another just cloud security podcast, which is also great. But the Google Cloud Security podcast obviously is also slightly better produced because they're funded by Google, and it's Google people run it. But they're both pretty cool. And then there's one that I've recently kind of rediscovered, which is called the Adversarial Podcast, which used to be in its first season something different, which is what was called, I think, something like Life After CISO, which was essentially a former CISO of, I think, the New York Stock Exchange or some kind of stock exchange organization, kind of explaining a bit what he did after his CISO tenure of like 20 years was over, which was super interesting. Also, again, for me, looking at kind of, what can I do after my CISO tenure is over at the end of this year. And now it's himself and two other current or former CISOs essentially looking at kind of things currently going on. Like, for example, the CrowdStrike incident, they had an analysis of this. And that's super interesting because it's not just essentially security practitioners, but kind of seasoned CISOs who have just interesting perspectives on things. And it's more strategic, it's more high level than just the operational kind of useless comments I see on LinkedIn all the time of like, why didn't they fix whatever vulnerability after any breach, right? Which is not a helpful comment from anyone or for anyone. And so these people, they have very cool perspectives on things, and it's very, very helpful also maybe for people who want to look into that job. I think it's good to understand, I would say, kind of the plane of thinking those guys follow, because it's I think in many cases it's a bit of an abstraction level higher than many people think about these issues. So very cool. Can definitely recommend that. And then, as I mentioned this earlier, Phil Venables, CISO of Google Cloud, he has a blog. You can also follow him on LinkedIn. Very, very, very interesting perspectives. Very, very smart guy. Also, essentially, same kind of level of thinking, where it's beyond the kind of obvious, well, of course, you need to do vulnerability prioritization or something like that, right? It's always a bit a step beyond, always a bit kind of, what are the economics of this? How does this fit culturally? And it's very, very smart perspectives. I really like reading this stuff.
Wow, thank you so much. We'll put the links in the description for the things that you've mentioned. And thank you so much for your time and the insights on the podcast. Your expertise and the wealth of knowledge and the golden nuggets that you shared today is invaluable and really appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you.